Good day, everyone. This is Meredith Leon McCormick for World Bride Magazine. I want to thank you all for your constant support of our first WBM summer series, where we brought you some of the best professionals in the market, whether it's the wedding or the fashion industry. But we were living in challenging time, and we still are living in challenging times. And some pandemic within a pandemic has occurred, and one of them happens to be the issue of Black Lives Matter and what Black families are doing and how are they surviving this. So for me, I wanted this to be very special as we ended this series with someone really important to the history of the Black family. But before I introduce you as who this esteemed guest is, I wanted to ensure you that all this content will live on all our social media platforms. That means Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. So continue to follow us. So I am going to read her resume to you, at least a portion of it, so you know how amazing this woman is. She is the Edwards Professor of American History, Professor of History and African American Studies at Princeton University. She is an author and a book author of some of the most amazing pieces of literature that have impacted and educated so many people about the African American history. And this current book that I have chosen to read, because it makes nothing but sense for World Bride Magazine and our reading, is Bound in Wedlock: Slave and Free Black Marriages in the 19th Century. So I am proud and honored to introduce you to Dr. Professor Tera W. Hunter. Dr. Hunter, welcome.
Thank you so much, Meredith, for inviting me to be a part of your platform. I really appreciate you featuring my book.
Oh, I think your book is an affirmation for everything that I've ever wanted to convey to people, from an intellectual and emotional and documented format. You have eloquently did all my homework for me. Thank you for that.
I'm happy to do your homework for you anytime.
So can you please first tell us the name of the book from your mouth and why you felt it was important for you to document the history of African American people in this piece of literature?
The title of the book is Bound in Wedlock: Slave and Free Black Marriages in the 19th Century. So I think it's a good time to think about African American history as we're talking about and dealing with the Black Lives Matter movement. We want to get to know the longer view of African American history as we think about what's happening right now, so that we fully understand what African Americans have experienced for centuries in this country. And so my book is really filled with lots of stories of ordinary people who aren't really known beyond their immediate communities. And it's also filled with some stories of people who were ordinary but became extraordinary. For example, I talk about stories like William and Ellen Kraft. These were two enslaved people who ran away from Georgia to go to the North. And they did so with Ellen disguising herself as a man and William playing along as her enslaved person. And they traveled by rail. They ended up in the North. And what motivated their escape was family, their desire to have a regular family, to have protections that most people who were free were able to take for granted. So part of the motivation for me writing this book has to do with telling those stories. I really, as a historian, like to tell those stories that are not well known, the stories about individuals who are ordinary people, and really give us a sense of what every day was like for people who weren't necessarily the most famous in their times.
And I do have to say that you started the book on a personal note from, I believe it's your great-grandparents, Moses and Ellen. So can you elaborate, and their marriage license, which I'm going to hold up for people to see. I hope they can see it. But they have their original marriage license that you have a photograph in the book. Can you elaborate on the connection and why? I mean, your family history is rich in itself, but that starts the tale of telling why marriage and the legality issues arise because of that for Black people. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So the marriage certificate is from my great-great-grandparents, Ellen and Moses Hunter. Moses was born in South Carolina around 1835. Ellen was born in Georgia around 1850 or so. And they met in Elberton, Georgia. And so these are the ancestors we can trace back to, and actually we can trace even further back to two women, one who was born in Africa, moved to Jamaica, was born in Africa around 1795, and another woman who was born in Virginia around 1775. So those are the two ancestors that we can trace all the way back from Moses and Ellen. And so this marriage certificate comes from the 1873. And so they were both enslaved, and they married shortly after the Civil War. The Civil War ended in 1865. And like many African Americans who were former slaves, many of them married, sort of formalized their existing marriages from slavery, or married for the first time in this period of what we call Reconstruction, the period after slavery ends, the period after the Civil War, from about 1865 to about 1877. And so their marriage license is really reflective of a broader trend that was happening among African Americans at the time, formalizing marriages that were previously not allowed to be legal. And so I had this marriage certificate from one of my family members who actually does a lot of the research on our family history, my dad's cousin, Bruce, who is a retired engineer. He is a person that basically found this document. And so I had it as a kind of inspiration piece that I had posted on my wall. And as I did more and more research, I realized that even though this is a personal document related to my family history, it also reflects the larger history of African Americans and the stories that I wanted to tell. So I decided to really incorporate them into the book as well.
It was brilliant. I love the way how you explained it. And I think for the first time in my understanding of American and African American relationships and the issue of in the 1700s when it became unlawful for marriages to happen between Blacks, whites, and separation of the races and the cultures by the landowners under the crown. The reason I gathered you wrote the book and you highlighted it in the book was to show how the lack of Black people being allowed to get married, it was a direct effect on their economic status within this society. So then it became easier for them to break up the family, not own any property, not be able to build wealth, and they would stay enslaved, and they would sell themselves to slaves to survive. And your book just literally opened up my eyes completely to things that I didn't even think of. So for me, who was your intent? My question to you is, who would be your intended reader, for this book?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think my ideal reader is anyone who is interested in African American history, people who are curious. As I said, we're in this moment now when lots of people are sort of open to learning more about our history, our collective history. And African American history is integral to the history of the nation. We really can't fully know and understand American history without also understanding the role that African Americans have played. So I'm really, I sort of geared the book to not just academics, not just scholars like myself, but to general readers, people who are curious, people who want to know more, and people who want to understand the longer history of African American families going back to the early 1800s.
Well, it was very informative to me that it brought it into modern times. But what did you want them to walk away from with this information? Because it was a lot. You know, for me,
Yeah.
I can say I walked away with knowing and understanding the breakdown in the Black family, the question of Black love, and how Black love is able to engage or disengage, and why we do it. And back then it was survival and not knowing the certainty, you know, the certainties of whether we could even have a union, because at any moment the slave master can sell you to another. And then you talked about also about conjugal visits and all the disconnection, you know. So what, can you kind of work me through that?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, there's so many different takeaways, but just to start with something that people can relate to, we've had this fight for marriage equality. We now have a law that says basically marriage is open to everyone, whether you're straight, whether you're gay. And so people have an awareness now that marriage has not always been available to everyone. But I don't think that people understand that marriage has not always been available to all, even straight people. And so, so I think that's one big takeaway that I want people to understand, is that we have a history of marriage in this country where some people, even straight people, were denied legal rights to marry. And they weren't allowed to marry legally as enslaved people. Largely because of the profit motives of slaveholders. So not allowing them to marry meant that slaveholders could separate them if they wanted to for whatever reasons, often because they wanted to sell one partner away from the other. The lack of legal recognition also allowed slave owners to sexually violate women, which they did quite often. It meant that parents did not have control over their children. And it meant in some cases that people were put together as couples who didn't necessarily want to be couples. So there were coerced relationships that African Americans had to endure. And so the denial of legal rights was a very crucial part of the nature of the system of slavery, the oppressive nature of the system of slavery, because it gave the slave owners full control over what were considered basic human rights: the right to love, the right to build families together, the right to create kinship ties without external interference. And so slave owners basically held those rights for themselves and denied them to African Americans. And I want people to understand that African Americans valued marriage and family. Sometimes that message doesn't get out in the general public. And again, you can't fully understand how much African Americans relied on family, how families enabled their survival for centuries. And so the marriages and the families provided a kind of counterbalance to the sufferings that they endured. African Americans invested in very broad definitions of kinship. So they incorporated people into their networks, people who were related to them by blood, but not just those who were related to them by blood. And so that those broad notions of kinship meant that they had very expansive views about who they considered family, what family meant to them, and they fought for those families. They fought despite the odds of being separated. They fought even in cases where they might be punished for defending each other, for defending one another. like husbands defending and standing up for their wives and vice versa, and standing up for their children. And so all of these things are important for us to revisit in our history.
Well, you totally answered my other question, which was, what does a marriage mean to the African American family during slavery? Because that's what people want to X out and say, oh, Black people don't get married, because that's one of the challenges that I faced when creating World Bride magazine, or there was lack of representation of Black women, Black bodies, Black men in advertisement, in editorials, as though to say that Black people didn't get married, where in fact, and there's a portion of the book where you quote Dr. Du Bois, where he talked about, there is a disconnect and Black families were suffering, but there was still hope for them, because the whole concept of marriage has been removed from them because of slavery. So now they have to rebuild all over again. And then I believe in one of your talks and your presentation, you made point to the fact that some people, Black people, question if they should get married. It became a question of whether I should or I couldn't, because that fear was still in there. Well, how much control do I have over it? People today complain about, marriages that are made by their parents, in different cultures. But can you imagine someone else determining who you marry? So your book was very enlightening to me in those areas, explaining what the breakdown of the Black family, where it stems from. It is not something that we are born in and say, no, we don't want it, because all human beings, like you mentioned, is part of our human rights to love, family, and all of that. But when that's denied of you for centuries, it becomes almost impossible to even think it possible. So which leads me to the question, how do you feel your book explains the history of marriage in American society and addresses some of the challenges Black families face today?
Mm-hmm. Well, just to back up a bit, I would say that, even though African Americans, as you pointed out, really pondered, whether they should get married, that was sort of the serious nature of knowing what the burdens would be, what the obstacles would be. And yet, what's remarkable is that they chose marriage over and over again. They chose families, even with the threats always looming over them that those families could be split apart. And so families created a sense of emotional bonds. It created a sense of mutuality, of intimacy, of companionship, of love. And for those who were religious, they felt a sense of Christian duty to marry. Now, they also had to work against how slaveholders used marriage. They used it as a way of controlling. Or at least they attempted to use it as a way of controlling enslaved people, to try to encourage them to reproduce more slave property, as a way of keeping them essentially quiet on the plantations, to be satisfied with their conditions, to create a sense of stability, but also as a way of them, sort of making a case for their own salvation as Christians, that they were actually doing something, good for African Americans, even as they were denying African Americans the same rights that they enjoyed in their own marriages. So I think it's really important that we keep those things in mind in terms of both the struggles, but also what they had to overcome and their willingness to basically take on those challenges, even with their eyes wide open and knowing the kind of capricious conditions that they were living under.
Right. And it's tough It's tough for us today. I can't even imagine how tough it was back then in just dealing and raising family and children with all these obstacles against you. And I almost feel like a lot of it hasn't gone away. While we have privileges, you know, the privilege now of getting married and choosing to get married, we still have to face the challenge of not being able to provide for our families in the same way other demographics are able to do so. And your book clearly shows that it stems far before any of this. This is not something we woke up this morning and said, oh, we're not going to get married and we just want to be stuck on poor and not do anything. It's systemic. There's history tracing even back as far as the 1700, where you focus on the 1900s and the 20th century. There's still hope for us there, but it started when the economy started to change, globalization, and wealth and capitalism, and black bodies became commodity. And your book shows the impact it's had on us mentally, that can help us go through the process of dealing with the death and the murders that have been taking place as of late during this pandemic. So for me, your book is a must read for anybody. So for the last thing, like, I sort of kind of wanted to talk to you about, what message do you want today and future generations to understand about the economic impact that plagues the Black race and the basic denial of marriage?
Well, I think it's important to understand that economics have impacted all families historically. And so what we're dealing with now is different from what people dealt with in the period that I study in the 1800s. So the book covers the entire 19th century, going from 1800 to 1900. But then at the very end, the epilogue is about the 20th century. It's about, how do we understand marriage today in light of these patterns that have taken place across time? And so I think it's important for us to know that economics impacts everyone, but African Americans are more impacted by economics, which then impacts their families, because we've been disproportionately impacted by inequities in our society historically. And those patterns have changed, but they have not ceased. So we've made progress, yet the basic story of African American history is that we've eliminated certain forms of oppression like slavery, but then other forms of subjugation are allowed to be constructed to replace those previous systems. So we went from slavery to Jim Crow, disfranchisement of voting rights, sharecropping system, debt peonage system, convict leasing. And today we have mass incarceration. And today we're still dealing with unequal conditions in terms of jobs, in terms of wages, in terms of wealth, in terms of education and housing. So these are all systems of oppression that impact people's abilities to form families, to maintain those families. And so again, it's really important that we understand that history and understand how do we get to the place where we are today. And understand that we can't really be a democratic society without economic justice, without social justice, without political justice. And so I think my book really helps us to understand the context that will help us to get there one day.
And your book totally helped me so much. I think the book is so tattered up from me writing and putting sticky notes all over it that it brought me inspiration to clarify so much that has been misunderstood by Black people, Black love, and everything else. So I can't thank you enough for the book. So the thing that I got most out of it for today's time and what we're dealing with is, before anybody can judge a Black person as to why they're not doing a certain thing, or why Black families and Black people are asking for equity, It's because the wealth of every family depends on the structure of the family. And to be able to pass things on, generational wealth starts only if you allow me to have a family and ownership of anything. So without those things, we're nothing. We're not a society of any of those things, the Constitution that we so want to hang our hats up to. So thank you so much for your book. I have more questions. I can spend hours with you. Can you give us a last statement and where people can find you and your book and any lectures that are coming up or any other projects?
Well, probably the easiest place to find me is on Twitter. I'm probably on Twitter way too much. So I know I have an event coming up next week. So if you go to my Twitter page, which is basically my name, Tera W. Hunter, you will find whatever events that are coming up. I also have a website, same name, same terawhunter.com. And just Meredith, I really appreciate what you said in terms of like how much you got from the book, how you've read it, and you have these pages that are dog-eared. I mean, you're my ideal reader. I want people like you to read it and appreciate it, and you've done that. And I want people to understand and remember the resilience, the creativity, the adaptability. These are also legacies of that African Americans have passed on generation after generation within their families and beyond their families. So I think it's important that we also remember the not just the struggles, not just the oppression, but also the ways that people really worked around those struggles and created something meaningful for their lives.
Yes, they sure did. And thank you for documenting that for us so clearly and beautifully. And I can share with my children proudly. So, Dr. Hunter, thank you and have a good night.
You too. Thanks a lot.
So, guys, that was Dr. Tera Hunter, W. Hunter. Please make sure you grab the book. Oh, my goodness. You can see how much I've gone through this book. It is amazing. There's just facts after facts. She has notes that she took. Why did I bother to do this? Because while you ask questions, what's the difference? Why do we care so much about Black lives and Black love? It's because there was so much taken away, so much denied for Black people in general, that it has to start from the beginning. So once you understand the root of the problem, then we can move forward. Without addressing the past, there is nothing to look forward to. So until the next series, thank you for your continued support. All of this will definitely live on our YouTube, Instagram, and Facebook. Please, guys, stay safe and stay well. Ciao, Bella.